Good morning, everyone. Thanks for braving the rain to come join us today. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Deputy Director for the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia here at the Wilson Center. As you all know, tomorrow, Pakistanis will go to the polls for what shall prove to be a very consequential election. One could argue that there's a fair amount at stake on July 25th. If all goes according to plan, and I'd like to hope that's not too big of an if, then the election will mark the second consecutive democratic transfer of power in Pakistan, and it will mark a full decade of uninterrupted civilian rule. And 10 straight years of civilian rule is nothing to sneeze at in a country where the military has held power directly for about half of its existence. There's arguably a fair amount riding on this election for the two main parties contesting it, the incumbent Pakistan Muslim League-Nawaz, PMLN, and the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the PTI. For the PMLN, which has faced a slew of problems, to put it mildly, in recent months, including corruption charges that, of course, resulted in the recent conviction and sentencing to 10 years of prison for former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. So for the PMLN, the election is an opportunity for redemption, an opportunity to show that the party is still strong, capable of governing. And for the PTI, it's obviously a very different story. I think the election represents perhaps the greatest opportunity in the party's 22-year history to hold national power for the first time. So it's been a pretty fraught, bitter, and deadly election, as you all know. The PMLN and PTI have sparred over practically the entire 5-year period of the last government. PTI has essentially accused the PMLN of electoral fraud ever since the 2013 election that the PMLN won in a big way. And the PMLN has suggested that the PTI has received support from the army and has suggested that the army is trying to help the PTI behind the scenes. And in a period when terrorist violence has been down significantly in Pakistan over the last few years, the country's been rocked by a series of terrorist attacks on election candidates over the last few weeks, including one in Baluchistan that killed, I believe, about 140 people, which made it the deadliest attack in Pakistan since the horrific school massacre in Peshawar in 2014. And above all else, this is a pretty closely contested election. It will likely be decided in Punjab, which of course is Pakistan's biggest province. And essentially, if you win Punjab, you'll win the election. Both the PMLN and the PTI have their strongholds in Punjab. So anyway, there's a lot to talk about, and much more than we could cover in our allotted time, so we won't get to cover every angle, but we do hope to hit on some of the major issues and questions at play, which include developments involving Pakistan's political parties, the possible role, which a lot of people in this town are always seeming to want to talk about, the possible role of the military in the election, what that might be, if anything, and what this election and its various possible outcomes could mean for the U.S. and its interests and its policies in Pakistan. So in our Q&A, we'll certainly get into a lot of other issues as well. So we've got a great panel to discuss the election in Pakistan. Very briefly, you should have the bios in front of you. To my right is Dr. Mariam Mufti, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And her research focuses on political parties in Pakistan, among other things. And one of her projects involves looking at producing a detailed historical and contemporary examination of Pakistan's party system. We also have with us Dr. Sahar Khan, who is a visiting research fellow at the Cato Institute. Her research interests include militancy, counterterrorism policies, and anti-terrorism legal regimes in South Asia. And she was, before earning her doctorate, she was the associate editor of the Washington Quarterly at CSIS. And finally, we have Tamana Salakudin, who's a senior expert on peace processes at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And she has expertise in a wide range of South Asia-related topics, including governance and domestic reform in Pakistan. She's held a series of previous positions with the U.S. government, including director for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the NSC. So with that, it's a great panel. We'll have 3 brief presentations from our speakers, and then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A. Let me just say before we start, for those of you here and watching our live stream, feel free to tweet about this event, and if you do so, please use the hashtag PACElection2008.
18, perhaps?
Yes, 2018, even
Okay,
better.
then.
Yeah.
We've
Thanks
just
for
got
that
10
course
years back.
correction. Yeah.
Okay.
That's true. But we'll talk about the present one today. So, Mariam, why don't you start us off?
All right. Well, thank you very much for making your way through the rain and coming to this panel. I'm very happy to be here. I have been working on, as Michael mentioned, Pakistan's party system now for over 10 years and closely monitoring the elections that have occurred in 2008, 13, and now 2018. Now, what I want to do in today's in today's talk, in the 10 to 12 minutes that I have, is briefly touch on 3 things. I want to talk about the changes in Pakistan's party system that have come to light with this particular election. Number 1, focusing especially on the emergence of the religious political parties and the way they have stepped into the electoral arena in a very big way. This time, I want to talk about candidate selection and what that tells us about how these political parties have put forward their platforms in this particular election, and maybe talk about what we're likely to see happen tomorrow as far as the electoral result is concerned. The third thing I want to very quickly touch on are some very, very positive stories that have emerged from this particular election as well. When we talk about Pakistan, we tend to get very, very pessimistic about what's going on over there, and there are some really, really there's some bright stories here. There's some bright, shiny moments that have come out of this election, and I'd like to quickly touch on those as well. So without further ado, let me get started. The party system in Pakistan, it's very hard to think about Pakistan's party system based on what we know of political party evolution in the Western European context and even in the North American context. It's very hard to compare Pakistan to that. And as a political scientist, I'm very conscious of setting Pakistan and thinking about Pakistan in its natural context. So with that, I'm not necessarily going to define Pakistan's party system in the same way we do in the Western world, but in fact say that in Pakistan, you've got 4 different types of political parties. You've got the mainstream political parties like the Pakistan Muslim League-Nawaz, the Pakistan Muslim League-Qaid, which is now out, which used to be Musharraf's party, the PMLQ, or the party that he had facilitated when he came to power. The PPP, Pakistan People's Party, and the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, led by ex-captain of the cricket team, Imran Khan, right? Now, what's particular about these 3 parties and why are we lumping them together? All 3 political parties came to be catch-all, okay, which is a term that was given by Kirkheimer back in 1966. So catch-all in the sense that they are not necessarily putting out distinct ideological programs that are distinct from each other, okay, or at least distinguish the political parties as being different from the other parties. The second thing that why we put these parties together is because they came to be nationally representative. Now, nationally representative in this context means that these are parties that are fielding candidates in all 4 provinces of Pakistan, and at least claim that they will have representation in all 4 provinces of Pakistan. Now, what's interesting about this particular election is that that's not necessarily true. There are a lot of other political parties that are actually fielding candidates all over Pakistan, especially the religious political parties. So this label of being nationally representative, I don't think is something that these political parties can lay claim to exclusively. The other thing I would say about the PMLN and PPP, at least, is that together these parties since 1988 have claimed about 72% of the vote base and the seat share in the national legislature. So they are the 2 largest parties in Pakistan, or have been historically. Now, add to this a third political party, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which demonstrated its viability as a political party back in 2011, performed reasonably well in 2013, winning the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, previously Northwestern Frontier Province, winning the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and forming the provincial government over there, and entering the opposition in the national legislature. So they did reasonably well. This time, however, PTI is angling to win the big prize. Imran Khan desires to be the prime minister, and he is hoping that tomorrow his political party is going to be successful. And they've done everything to achieve this electoral success, in that they've been very politically expedient. They have welcomed many party switchers, so people who switched over from the other political parties thinking that they're going to fail contesting on other party platforms, and they've entered PTI. They have also overlooked their own constitution in selecting candidates. I just want to mention this, that in the constitution of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, there is a clause that says that if a politician is known to have been corrupt and and their financial documents show that they have defaulted on their loans, they cannot be selected as candidates, and the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf has clearly overlooked that in the selection of candidates that it's selected this time for to contest elections. So that's what I'm going to say about the mainstream political parties. We've been reading a lot about these parties, and maybe we should not be paying so much attention to them today. I do want to talk about the religious political parties. What's different this time round in this particular election, and I think a US audience would be particularly interested in knowing about these parties, is because the Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal, which ceased to exist in 2008, because the Jamaat-e-Islami, a major component of this particular alliance of religious parties, boycotted the election. Only the Jamiat-e-Ulama-e-Islam continued ahead under the leadership of Fazlur Rahman, who was, again, another very politically expedient politician who likes to be part of the government, no matter what the ideology, no matter what the political party. They actually resuscitated their alliance and came back in a big way. I wrote earlier in May that the coming together of MMA could actually have a serious impact on the 2018 election, but that hasn't actually come to pass. I was wrong. The MMA has in fact been sidelined by some of the other sectarian groups that have actually decided to contest the election this time round. So a few things that need to be mentioned. Sectarianism has reared its ugly head in Pakistan's election, in particular this time, with Barelvi groups attempting to form seat adjustment deals with one another to make sure that they manage to secure a substantial number of seats this time round. So I am talking about the Tehreek-e-Labbaik, Ya Rasulallah, TLY, led by Khadim Hussain Rizvi. This is a political party that emerged earlier on in the year this year, when Khadim Hussain Rizvi was conducting a march towards the capital. Khadim Hussain is a known proponent of the Barelvi school, which is a reformist movement that began in the 19th century in response to British colonialism in northern India. The Barelvis are quite distinct from the Deobandis. We've heard the word Deobandi several times in reference to the Taliban, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. This time round, however, the Deobandi group is being represented by the previously known Sipai Sahaba, but this time Ahle Sunnat wal Jamaat, which is also contesting the election. We know that another faction of the Jamiat-e-Ulama-e-Islam, led by Samiul Haq, is also contesting on the Rahe-Haq platform. So Deobandi is represented by a number of these smaller political parties. The Barelvis are represented, like I already mentioned, by the Tehreek-e-Labbaik, but also by the Pakistani Sunni Tehreek, by the Nizam-e-Mustafa group. So the Barelvis are also represented by a number of smaller political parties, like I mentioned, the seat adjustments. And then, of course, you have, and this is particularly concerning to the United States, is Jamaatul Dawa, which put together a platform which they called the Milli Muslim League. The Milli Muslim League was not given permission by the Election Commission of Pakistan to actually field any candidates, and so they decided to change the name. And somehow the other, that made it okay for the Election Commission of Pakistan to let them contest. And so now they're contesting on the platform of Allahu Akbar Tehreek, or the AAT. Now, the AAT has known links to Jamaat al-Dawa, which is the front organization for the Lashkar-e-Tayyiba. And that's why it is of particular concern to the United States. In fact, some of you might have even seen the article in the New York Times that talked about how the Election Commission of Pakistan has somehow allowed or has okayed the nomination of certain individuals who were on terror watch lists around the world. So I want to mention a couple of these names. So Aurangzeb Farooqi, who is contesting on the Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat platform, on the Deobandi platform in Karachi. Shafiq Mengal, of a Baloch militant of the Baloch Musalla Dafai Tanzeem, who is known to have now joined the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. The Milli Muslim League, which was rejected because of its ties to Lashkar-e-Tayyiba, but Allahu Akbar Tehreek, which is being allowed to contest, which begs the question, what exactly happened this time around? Why is it that the Election Commission of Pakistan is not okay with the corrupt Nawaz Sharif from contesting this election, but is perfectly okay with letting known terrorists contest the election? So where are these religious political parties in fact getting some backing from the military? Is the military consciously making a decision to allow these political parties to contest and therefore mainstream them into the electoral process? I don't think there's any evidence for that. Okay, however, we can speculate that maybe that's what's going on. I think it's a very, very risky move, and it's risky for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that by allowing these political parties to mainstream into Pakistani politics by contesting the election, you're allowing these parties to actually showcase a softer image of themselves. And that can be a little risky. It can be risky because these political parties, by contesting the election, can actually demonstrate that they are not, that they're in fact progressive. So the Allahu Akbar Tehreek, and this is surprise, surprise, has fielded 14 female candidates on general seats across Pakistan. And this is significant because other political parties that are mainstream and secular and progressive apparently haven't done that much. Okay, so what is the Allahu Akbar Tehreek up to right now? I mean, it's actually the most gender progressive party in Pakistan, which is shocking, right? So that's something to think about. The other thing is that these religious political parties, especially the Jamaat-e-Islami and the JUIF, are once again getting an opportunity to retain their traditional vote banks in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan. The JUIF in particular wants to retain its bargaining potential to make sure that it enters into the coalition that will eventually form the government post-election. This has always been JUIF's politics, and I think they're going to try to do that once more. Having the Jamaat-e-Islami contest with them in the form of an electoral alliance only makes it easier, ups their electoral chances. So that's what's happening there. But the smaller parties, all these names that I mentioned, Nizam-e-Mustafa, Tehreek-e-Labbaik, so on, all of these smaller parties are actually going to play the role of spoilers in very, very close contests between the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf and the PMLN in Punjab. Punjab, which is right now a province which is very close to call, there is a 7-point difference between the PMLN and the PTI, with PMLN with a lead. As per the survey that was conducted by Ideas in Pakistan and led by Ali Chima from Lahore University of Management Sciences. So according to the survey, these smaller political parties can actually play the role of a spoiler. So no surprise, both the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf candidates and the PMLN candidates has suddenly taken on a Barelvi message, a message in support of Barelvi ideology. All of a sudden, these candidates have started talking about Khatme-Nabuwat, which is about Prophet Muhammad being the seal of the prophets and being the last prophet of Islam. They're all of a sudden in support of Mumtaz Qadri. They're all of a sudden in support of the blasphemy law. in the constitution. That's what they've suddenly started talking about, because they don't necessarily want to lose some of their voters to these smaller groups. The one thing no one is talking about is the threat of extremism or terrorism. As Michael mentioned, this election has been a very violent election. We have lost 3 electoral candidates in 3 different constituencies. So in the attack that killed 120 people in Balochistan, the contestant Raisani was killed. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, there have been 2 attacks on Akram Durrani's convoy while he was campaigning in his constituency in Bannu, which is very close to the Fata region. And he survived both times, but these attacks have been quite violent. And at the same time, you all must have heard of ANP, Awami National Party candidate Bashir Balor, who was killed earlier in 2008. His father was also killed by the TTP in a similar suicide bombing. So it's been a very, very violent election, but this is an angle that very few people are in fact talking about. So mainstreaming these religious political parties, I'm not sure that if in fact the military is mainstreaming. We have no evidence of this, and that's not what I'm claiming. But if in fact that's the idea, it's a very, very risky move, is the point that I want to make. I do also want to give you guys these numbers. So right now, the Pakistan People's Party has fielded 225 contestants. That's the party that's fielded the most contestants nationally, okay? But Tehreek-e-Labbaik, Ya Rasulullah, is not that far behind. It's actually fielded 152 candidates across the country for about 248 constituencies. So I just want to say that these religious political parties can also make a similar claim of being nationally representative this time around. And they are, in fact, trying to very much garner support from all over the country, not just in specific pockets, which is what the Jamaat-e-Islami and the JUIF have traditionally done. So that's the big change from previous election years. Ethnic political parties in Pakistan, the Awami National Party, the MQM, the Baloch National Parties, they're too small. They don't have that much support right now amongst the voter base. Their support is very concentrated geographically. And yes, Pakistan has a first-past-the-post system, so that should work out in their favor, but not necessarily, because I do think that the entry of Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf into the election scene has actually eroded some of the support that these political parties used to have. Also, we know that the MQM took a real beating last year when it factionalized into MQM Pakistan, led by Farooq Sattar, broke away from the London faction, which was led by Altaf Hussain, and then, of course, Kamal Mustafa, who created the Pakistan Sarzamin Party. For PSP, this is a do-or-die election. If they make it, they make it. If they don't, well, that's the end of them. MQM Pakistan is going to try and retain its few seats in Karachi, but I'm not expecting big things. So where's Karachi going to go? That's the big prize. We don't know if those seats in Karachi are going to go to Jamaat-e-Islami, which used to have a traditional stronghold in Karachi back in the 1980s, or if supporters are going to turn to PPP, which is already very strong in rural Sindh, or if voters will turn to the PTI, which is looking like a really good option. But don't forget the very, very small political parties. Bear in mind that there's some 200 political parties registered with the Election Commission of Pakistan that have been allotted election symbols, that is, that they can contest. All right. Now, these small political parties, what hopes do they have? Well, there's some really interesting candidates that who are contesting this time. Gibran Nasir, some of you may have heard of him. He is a social activist. He's contesting in Karachi this time. His campaign has been attacked a couple of times. His supporters have been threatened in his constituency, but a lot of people are supporting him. So interesting. We have the Awami Workers' Party, which is a left political party in Pakistan, which has also fielded some interesting candidates that look like might actually win. And then, of course, there are other smaller political parties. I don't want to go into the names, but the media this time has paid a lot of attention to these small political parties because the leaders of these parties may, in fact, erode the support from the mainstream parties that people are turning away from because they're alienated from the larger political parties, and may actually give a chance to some of these newer entrants because they seem like cleaner politicians. So that's what I wanted to say about the party system. Two more things very quickly. The mainstream political parties, Pakistan Muslim League, Nawaz, and Pakistan People's Party, have entered this election quite weakened. Weakened because there has been a lot of party switching, rampant party switching prior to this election. This is not the first time party switching has occurred in Pakistan. Prior to every election in Pakistan since 1988, we have seen rampant party switching. And there's a lot of good research to actually speak to this particular point. What has happened this time round is that in the aftermath of the Panama leaks, in the aftermath of Nawaz Sharif's disqualification, a lot of PMLN members have switched political parties. Now, these members who've actually switched over to Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, thinking that PTI has a better chance of winning, are all those individuals who joined PMLN after PMLQ went under. Okay, to distance themselves from PMLQ's legacy of being a pro-military, co-opted political party, these individuals entered PMLN. They contested with on the PMLN platform in 2008 and 2013, and they have now once again switched political parties because that's what these candidates do. They are electables, and this is a word that's thrown around quite a bit in analyzing Pakistani politics. What do I mean by electable? I mean a political heavyweight, an individual who can contest elections and win elections without actually having a party support. So they can win elections on the basis of their own financial resources, on the basis of their own linkages with voters, because they have kinship networks with these individuals, biradri, which is a word that we hear quite often, or because they have such well-established records of service delivery and doling out of patronage to their voters, that the voters actually have a link to the candidate, not to the political party. So the party ticket doesn't matter for these individuals, okay? That's what makes these individuals electable. So political parties want electables to win an election, and PTI, because it's really, really desperate to win the prize, has taken on these electables, okay, overlooking its ideology for the sake of political expediency, for the sake of making sure that they win, okay? Imran Khan has been quoted to have said in many times, he's gone on the record and said, you know what, one man really can't win this election, so it's not going to be me. I need a team of electables. All right, then. He has his electables this year. Okay, so if there's any election that he can ever win, it's this one, because he has all the electables that he could ever possibly need. All right, so who's actually switched over into the PTI? A lot of politicians from Southwest Punjab have shifted their support to the PTI. These are individuals who are large landowners in the Punjab. They've taken their personal vote base, their personal vote bank, and moved over to the PTI. These are also individuals who are supporting the creation of a Saraiki province, a fifth province in Pakistan. The district of Jhang, many politicians from Jhang have switched over. So Ghulam Bibi Bharwana, to name a few examples, Nazir Sultan, these are all individuals who moved over to the PTI. Now, that's what's happened to the PMLN. Entered this election, okay, emaciated because it lost a lot of its politicians, okay. The PPP, however, has taken a beating because in Sindh, an alliance of electable politicians again came into being. It's known as the Grand Democratic Alliance, and people are predicting that the Grand Democratic Alliance could probably wrest away maybe 10 seats from rural Sindh from PPP. That's not going to ruin PPP's chances of forming government in Sindh Assembly, but nonetheless, it's lost substantial support. Now, because PPP was threatened by the GDA, PPP's candidate selection was also very, very politically expedient, much to the dismay of its traditional party worker, who was hoping to get rewarded a party ticket to contest the election, but the PPP leadership, Asif Ali Zardari and Bilawal Bhutto, decided otherwise. So that's the most interesting. So that's the most interesting thing you can say about candidate selection. At the end of the day, all political parties have performed very, very predictably when it comes to candidate selection. They have gone for the electable. They've gone for the person who can win votes on the basis of their personal vote bank, not necessarily on the basis of the party platform. What does that say about Pakistan's electoral system? Well, it's extremely candidate-centered. It's not about the political party. So if you want to see politics evolve and change in Pakistan, well, political parties really have to make their party platforms significant and worthwhile for candidates to actually contest from them and remain loyal to them, right? I mean, that's the problem of Pakistani politics. This party switching is problematic because political parties cannot elicit credible loyalty from its membership, from its candidates. So the good news in all of this, because I've pointed out quite a few negatives here. We have, for the first time, a Hindu woman contesting an election in Pakistan. We have a transgendered candidate contesting the election in Pakistan. This is the first time that the Supreme Court of Pakistan has asked all Pakistani political parties to nominate at least 5% of candidates contesting on general seats to be women. So all political parties have increased the number of women who've been nominated to general seats. We still have the reserved seats in place, but to general seats. Whether these women will win or not remains to be seen, because the seats that have been awarded to them are seats that are losing seats for the political parties. So we may not see an increase in women's representation in parliament, but at least there's a first step. For the first time, religious political parties, Jamaat-e-Islami and JUIF, changed their tune and actually went out and actively campaigned to bring the women vote out, which I think was a huge positive. They're changing their mind on women's representation and women's participation in politics. I think that's a good news story as well. What do I think is going to happen? Well, tomorrow, I think we are going to end up with a hung parliament. I don't think there's going to be any clear winners. It's a very, very close election, very hard to call. I don't really necessarily want to make predictions, but I will quote a survey that's being done by Dr. Ali Chima, the survey I mentioned earlier. In Punjab, PMLN is ahead of the PTI by about 7 points. 14% of the voters are undecided, and they're the ones who are really going to determine what ends up happening in the province of Punjab, and therefore we really cannot know what's going to happen. We really cannot predict. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, PTI has a clear lead and will probably take the province. PPP is 40 points ahead of PTI in the Grand Democratic Alliance, so is definitely going to win a majority in the Sindh Assembly. Balochistan is very, very divided. We've got about 14 seats at play over there, but just to give you a sense, 11 to 15% is the range of support for the mainstream parties, PPP, PTI, and the PMLN. 8% for the Muttahid Majlis-e-Amal, JUI and JI, Jamaat-e-Islami. And then the Baloch nationalist parties have about 6% support. So we really don't know what's going to happen in Balochistan. But I mean, are the stakes particularly high? I don't think so, because we're talking about 14 seats here. The real game is in Punjab. And I think that's the province everyone should be looking to see what exactly happens. Thank you. Did I go over time?
A little bit, but that's okay. It was very enriching material. Thank you. I mean, it was a tremendously rich survey of a very complicated environment for the political parties. So thank you, Mariam. And good news stories are always good. Yeah. For those standing, we do have some seats up front and on this side, so feel free to sit if you'd like. Sahar, let's go to you.
Sure. Can everybody? Oh, okay. Never mind. So good morning, everybody, and thank you, Michael, for organizing this great panel. It's my absolute pleasure to be speaking at the Woodrow Wilson Center today. Today, I'm going to be speaking to you specifically about civil-military relationships and the role the army may be playing in the election and why. Now, before we sort of talk about what's going on in the current election, it's really important to understand some of the background of Pakistan's civil-military imbalance. Now, for the past 70 years, Pakistan has experienced 4 military coups, which basically means that they have essentially spent half of their life under military rule. Most of military dictatorships have resulted in long-term military rule. The latest was General Pervez Musharraf from 1999 to 2007. Now, what this means is that it's resulted in a very unique evolution of the army specifically, which is one of the three of the armed services, but the most powerful one. The other two is the Navy and the Air Force. Now, the army in Pakistan, for those of you who may not be familiar, works as an economic and political organization. So it's basically part of Pakistan's economic and political life. Now, the Pakistan Army has, it owns farms, pharmaceutical companies, vocational training centers. The Fauji Foundation is one of the largest business conglomerates in the country. And the Army Welfare Trust owns commercial banks, fish farms, sugar and rice mills, and pharmaceutical companies. So we're not really talking, when we think about an army, we sort of think about soldiers and things that soldiers do. We don't necessarily think about fish farms. So Pakistan the Pakistani army is unique in this way. In the political realm, the military coups, like I had mentioned before, have resulted in sort of these long-term military dictatorships lasting, 8 to 10 years. Musharraf's was actually, I think, one of the shortest ones, which was 8 years. Now, the general elections are to be held tomorrow, as we know, and if they are held successfully, these will be the third consecutive elections, which is kind of a big deal for a country like Pakistan. Now, for tomorrow's election, the military has been accused by politicians, human rights organizations, and media personnel for doing three things that sort of look like interference in the political system and in the electoral campaigns. The first is targeting of the Muslim League-Nawaz. Now, traditionally, the army and Nawaz Sharif have had a very tumultuous relationship, to say the least. This was the third time that Nawaz Sharif was elected, but it turns out the third time was not the charm for the relationship between Nawaz Sharif and the army. Now, essentially, for the past 2 years especially, the army has been very focused on sort of reducing the credibility of the Muslim League and of Nawaz Sharif in particular. In fact, 2 years ago, the army, along with Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf's Imran Khan, filed a case against Nawaz Sharif, which has sort of resulted in his, ouster, his judicial ouster, his disqualification, and also currently why he's in jail for corruption charges. The army and, of course, PTI sort of denied the links that they have. They denied that they, united in this cause. And, of course, there's no empirical information, but this is sort of what media has reported over time. Now, the second thing that sort of indicates the military's interference in this election has been censoring of the media. Now, of course, traditionally, as military dictatorships do, they don't like an independent media, right? They want to censor the media, they want to limit newspapers, especially regional languages, or they plant stories in newspapers. And that way, the Pakistan military is sort of not unique. But since 2008, Pakistan has technically been a democracy. It's sort of undergoing a democratic transition, which means that the media has been a lot more free and independent than, say, would have been, prior to 2008. But Hamid Haroon, who's the chief executive of the Dawn Media Group, which is the largest English newspaper in Pakistan, and he's also the president of the All Pakistan Newspaper Society, wrote an op-ed on July 11th in the Washington Post, in which he discussed in great detail sort of how this time the targeting of the media and the media censorship is different than, say, in the past, right? And this time, it's about ensuring that the media does not provide independent coverage of Pakistan's central political problem, which is basically the divide between the civilian administration and the military establishment. He basically said, and I quote, "This is about the deepening power struggle between the military and civilian authorities," unquote. Now, Dawn has experienced a lot of pressure. Their newspapers were taken off the stands. Distributors have been harassed by army officials. Even TV cable networks have sort of decreased their live coverage and instead have gone to, pre-tapes where they're able to sort of censor the media or censor sort of anything that's anti-state or anti-Pakistan. Of course, anti-state, anti-Pakistan translates into anybody who's critical of the military. Now, of course, the military denies all of this, right, as militaries tend to do as well. But this has been really interesting in terms of the military, especially under former Chief of Army Staff Raheel Sharif, was very interested in improving its image. And so Raheel Sharif was sort of like, the best army chief, right? I mean, a lot of the newspapers sort of touted him as, the king of all kings. Like if he ran an election, he could win because he's just so good. And he really, over the past few years, has invested in improving the image of the army. And part of this image has been to say that, the army is not interested in political rule. The army is not interested in governing. The army is interested in protecting Pakistan and protecting Pakistan's borders. And, ruling is the civilian administration's job. This is sort of their official line, right? And, for the most part, on the surface, it seems like it's been working. I mean, this is the third consecutive election, like I mentioned, and it's kind of a big deal. But what's also been interesting is how they've been targeting the media. So, for example, in 2016, Cyril Almeida, who's a very sort of famous columnist in Dawn, he reported a story in which, the civilian leaders and military leaders were meeting in a sort of off-the-record meeting, talking about how to curb, the security situation in Pakistan, how to go after militant groups. And in the meeting, apparently, Chief Minister of Punjab, Nawaz Sharif, went and said that, he's very frustrated with the military because it seems like anytime law enforcement agencies arrest certain members of militant groups, the army puts pressure on them to let them go. And this is sort of, it's bad for Pakistan's image, it's bad for US-Pakistan relations, it's just sort of bad in general for Pakistan's credibility. Now, Cyril printed the story, Dawn printed the story, and then there was a big uproar. The media, the military and the government sort of went after Cyril and said this is completely untrue, it's completely fabricated. They asked Dawn to retract the story. Dawn said, we're not going to retract the story and we're behind our journalist. And so, the government put Cyril Almeida for a few weeks on an exit control list. And there's a big hoopla of how Cyril uncovered the story. But nobody really talked about the main issue, which was, why is the military putting pressure on the civilian government? And why are they asking the civilian government to free certain militants? That kind of got lost in sort of the big debate. But this also proves, Hamid Haroon's main point in his op-ed, which was this is really about the divide, the civil-military imbalance that Pakistan is facing right now. Now, the third thing that sort of accounts for, the interference of the military that the military is recently accused of, and which I kind of find the most interesting, is how over the past few years the military has sort of used the judiciary as a cover. And by that, what I mean is that they're sort of gotten into the space that was traditionally the judiciary space. Now, in Pakistan, the judiciary really focuses on being independent and really prides itself on being independent. It says that it's not corrupt. The judges are very sensitive about this kind of questioning, which I discovered in person when I asked them about corruption during my dissertation research. But, this sort of goes back to 2014 when the Army public school attack happened in December of 2014, which killed 130 children, and it was done by the Pakistani Taliban or Tehreek-e-Insaf Pakistan. And it sort of forced the military establishment who was under Rahil Sharif, and the civilian government, Nawaz Sharif was in power, to sort of come together and form a national action plan, which was like a 20-point plan that, got rid of the death penalty and said that it would focus on counterterrorism operations. But with respect to the judiciary, it established military courts. And the plan said that anybody who is charged under terrorism will be tried in military courts. Now, historically, any time the civilian administration or the military regime has created military courts to try civilians, the Supreme Court of Pakistan has always declared these military courts to be unconstitutional. This time, the military and the civilian administration got together, and according to news reports from Pakistan, the military establishment put pressure on the civilian leadership to make a constitutional amendment, to sort of not only just make a law, but also to amend the Constitution, in which, according to the Constitution, for those charged under terrorism, the separation of power principle would not apply. So that would mean that anybody who is charged under terrorism, a civilian, could be tried in a military court. And it's in the Constitution, right? And it's called the 21st Amendment. Now, when the first sort of trial happened and the first death sentences were ruled out, the case went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in 2016 was faced with the decision of, can they strike down a constitutional amendment? The Supreme Court basically ruled that they could not. So the 21st Amendment stands today, and the military courts continue to exist. They were supposed to exist for just a couple of years, from 2015 to 2017, but they've been extended for a couple of more years, and my impression is that they will continue to be extended. Now, this essentially means that civilians who are charged under the Anti-Terrorism Act of Pakistan will not be tried in anti-terrorism courts, which are sort of special civilian courts. They will be tried under court-martial law in military courts, right? Which is sort of I consider a big breach of power, right? I mean, this is sort of the judiciary's power of trying individuals is now, being used by the military. Now, essentially, I would say in all of this, and of course, all of this interference, the military has denied this. The current chief of army staff, General Bajwa, has also said that, the military is only providing security just because of the rise of violence. They are not politically involved. They're not backing Imran Khan. They're not backing certain candidates, etc. But I will say this, and I think for those of us who have watched Pakistan closely over the decades, I think it is fair to say that the Pakistan army views itself as the manager of the government rather than a subordinate, which means that they view themselves as leading the civilian side rather than the other way around. Now, for a democratic system to work, the military needs to be beholden to the civilian leadership. If the military controls foreign policy, it creates a military-centric approach, a military-centric policy, in which every single foreign policy problem seems like something that the military should solve. It's like that saying, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So if a military is in power, they're going to view everything as something that can be solved by the military, which is not always the case, because there's a lot to say about diplomacy. Before you sort of deploy your forces, you want to at least have some sort of diplomatic relationship, which if the military sort of remains in power, especially the way that it has been in Pakistan, and if it kind of maintains control over Pakistan's national security interests and foreign policy formation, then it's going to be really dangerous for Pakistan. Also, I think for a country like Pakistan, that's a developing country, that's experiencing a youth bulge, that needs to develop economically, having a military in power in this way is very dangerous. And then I will say with one last point about the elections itself. I think Mariam did a really good job of sort of talking about why the military would be backing religious groups, and there's no evidence of this. And again, I'm not also saying that there is. If they are, it's a really risky thing to do. But I will say this, that whoever does win the election, whoever comes out in the majority, if it's not a hung parliament, they will have to focus on sort of two things. One is Pakistan's economy and the role of CPEC and the amount of jobs that can be created. 64% of Pakistan's population is under the age of 29. 64% of young people who want jobs, who want to get married and have kids, who want to buy a house and buy a car, who want to study abroad and live in Pakistan and, do all things that young people worldwide want to do. Now, whether or not the political parties actually have the capacity to meet these demands is a separate issue. But if the military, if it keeps interfering the way that it has been, it really undermines political parties and sort of the potential of civilian leadership that is in Pakistan. The second issue that I think the new administration will have to focus on is really sort of the institutional battles that have been going on, sort of especially the tussle between the judiciary and the executive, and the judiciary and the legislative branch. Separation of powers is something that, is I would say useful, and I think for Pakistan's purposes, it would be good to sort of go back to the separation of power and think about how these institutions can serve the country. Part of that would mean the military sort of giving up its power, which may seem unlikely, but we'll just have to see how it evolves. I will end on a positive note, which is, as I said before, these elections are a big deal. I grew up in Karachi in the 1990s 'During Benazir's rule. I was going to say reign, but I feel like that might be politically incorrect. But during, Benazir's rule. And, it was growing up in that environment, I never really thought that Pakistan could have elections consecutively. The people still like the military, right? I mean, civilian leadership over time has always turned to the military. So it's not like the military is just existing and, takes over power like some sort of dragon. Oftentimes, when things get tough, the civilian leadership calls the military in. They prefer the military to, local law enforcement agencies and provincial law enforcement agencies. So it's not just the military's fault that they're sort of, in the position that they are in. But that said, I do feel very good about the fact that Pakistan is going to experience its third election tomorrow. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sahar. We're definitely putting some really interesting stuff on the table to set the stage for a good discussion. But first, wanted to go to Tamana to provide a bit of a U.S. angle on all this.
Sure. Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting us. And thank you to Dr. Khan and Dr. Mufti for really great in-depth look at the elections. I want to step back a little bit and talk about the Pakistani elections from a U.S. perspective. I just last fall left the U.S. government, but spent 12 years in government in a host of different positions, focused on South Asia and primarily on Pakistan for much of my career. I got to spend the 2008 elections as a political officer in Islamabad. 2013 elections, I was monitoring elections in Lahore with Ambassador Rafael, so have lived through the last two elections, and I'm excited that Pakistan is embarking on this second transition from one civilian rule to another. But we are, from sitting here in Washington, entering these 2018 Pakistani elections in a period where the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is really close to the nadir. It can always get worse, yes, but it is pretty close. It's probably at its lowest point, in my estimation, since 2011. And if you remember 2011, that was the year of Ray Davis in Lahore. That was the year of the Abbottabad raid. That was the year of the Salalah incident. That was the year I was a director of Pakistan at the White House. It was not a good year. But since that period, we have seen the relationship go up and down as it usually does. But right now, it is at a point where it is, I would say, almost non-existent. So unlike 2011, where many instances or incidents caused the relationship to really almost break, right now I think we are almost in the absence of any positive or constructive relationship. And we have our ambassador and our diplomats still in country working hard, but I think from Washington, there is just really a very narrow lens in which we see the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. And it hasn't been because of any significant change in behavior of either side. Our U.S.-Pakistan behavior towards one another, good and bad, has continued fairly in the same way, but our views of each other have really changed a lot. So with the myriad of domestic and international crises that the U.S. administration is currently facing, I would say Pakistan is nowhere near the top of the list. So it's also somewhat of neglect that you could characterize this relationship with. When Pakistan is discussed, it's very much narrowly through the lens of Afghanistan. So it is maybe sometimes with nuclear security, but primarily through the lens of Afghanistan. And I think President Trump's January 1st tweet is very illustrative. The quote, "The United States has foolishly given Pakistan more than $33 billion in aid over the last 15 years. They have given us nothing but lies and deceit. They give safe haven to the terrorists we hunt in Afghanistan with little help, no more." Similarly, the administration's South Asia strategy, which came out last August, clearly outlines our intentions with regard to Pakistan. Quote, "America's interests are clear. We must stop the resurgence of safe havens that enable terrorists to threaten America, and we must prevent nuclear weapons and materials from coming into the hands of terrorists and being used against us or anywhere in the world for that matter." So as you can see, our focus on Pakistan, or our lack thereof, when we do look at Pakistan from a U.S. government or U.S. administration perspective, is really about Afghanistan, and then secondly, through the lens of nuclear security. But I would also argue that this has changed in terms of quality, but these priorities have largely stayed the same. So if you go through the Bush administration and the Obama administration and now the Trump administration, U.S. interests in Pakistan have usually been one since 2001, Afghanistan, because that's where we are, that's where our troops are, that's our immediate interest. Number two, India, preventing any sort of breach, something like a repeat of Mumbai or any nuclear escalation or conventional escalation with India. Three, nuclear security. which is very important to us. And 4, and this is the one that often gets ignored or falls to the wayside, is general South Asia stability. And when we talk about stability, that's where you lump in, in my time in policymaking circles, that's where the demographic realities that Sahara alluded to, institutions, civil mill balance, democratic institutions, all of that comes under stability. Unfortunately, the top 3 are usually so immediate and take up so much space that the last one, stability, often falls to the wayside. And so that is the reality with which I think we are facing or looking at the Pakistan elections. And so in that context, I'd like to discuss some of the implications for the U.S. In 2013, when I was at the NSC, I chaired an interagency working group on the Pakistan elections. And it was very interesting. And as I mentioned, we sent a team of folks from Washington to join our embassy to monitor elections in Pakistan. It was more of a symbolic monitoring. But we also, through USAID and others, helped fund election monitoring events, to help fund election technical support. So there was a great deal of interest, I think, in Washington and the USG about helping the Pakistani elections. Since that time, I think any pretense of trying to have a positive partnership or support governance and democracy has largely fallen to the wayside. There's really not a carrot or sticks approach. Many of you may remember Ambassador Holbrook's embrace of Pakistan and see if the carrots worked. So they didn't work because, as many of us argued, you really can't change a country's national security calculus that way. So I think largely now we have decided, the U.S. government has decided to narrow its focus back to Afghanistan, as I mentioned. So for this year's election, there is not any monitoring teams. There is not a lot of active interest here. And also, I think the security that you both mentioned has actually limited the amount of monitoring that both Americans and other Westerners, the EU and others, can actually do. So traditional embassies, Western embassies, do host monitors, but this year they are unable to do that because of the security restrictions imposed by the Pakistani government and the Pakistani military. So that's unfortunate. My fellow panelists detailed some of the politics and the maneuvering in parties leading up to the election, but I want to broadly touch on some of the trends that I think are important to U.S. interests, and especially since the post-Musharraf period. You can see these trends going through 2008, 2013, and now culminating in 2018 with these very significant elections. The first, I would say, is the emergence of PTI, which our panel has really discussed here. If many of you remember back in the days of Musharraf, Imran Khan could barely win his Miawali seat, right? So nobody expected this. And then there was a boycott in 2008. In 2013, I think it was amazing that he was splitting in Punjab, splitting the second place seat in many constituencies with PPP, and then with a lot, stealing electables from PPP and other parties. And now he's a major force in 2018. I think it's really interesting from the USG's perspective to watch, because he's someone who's claimed to be unwilling to be a loyal opposition, and anyone who knows Imran Khan's temperament, he likely will not be a person who is good at making a coalition government. So if it's unlikely that he would win outright, who would he form a coalition with, and how would he be in that coalition? Most likely not with PMLN, but even with PPP, would he be able to maintain a government, and what would that mean? I think it's also interesting in terms of relationships with the United States. We have very long relationships with, the same politicians in PMLN and PPP, and some of these parties go back decades. PTI, even though many of them have come from other places, the new faces in PTI do not have that depth of relationship with our policymakers or with our diplomats. And so that is something I think that causes a barrier, that relationship needs to be developed there. Interestingly, the splintering that you mentioned of other parties, PPP, almost you could say is no longer even a national party with their 2013 results, and maybe this year, if they are unable to really win outside of Sindh, what does that mean? Who emerges beyond PTI as a national candidate? Or is this further broken into regionalized parties beyond PMLN and PPP? again, I think the anti-incumbency and sort of the neutering of PMLN has a huge impact on state stability. If Northern Punjab and even Central Punjab still supports Nawaz Sharif and sees this push by the judiciary or the military against Nawaz Sharif as orchestrated, what does that mean for state stability? What does that mean for political violence going forward? These are all, I think, concerns of the U.S. Some of the other trends which we've alluded to, I think, are really interesting. Under the PPP government in 2008, there was devolution from the center out to the provinces, and under PMLN, that was brought back to the center. For U.S. interests, devolution, while very good in principle, as it was actually practiced, was very difficult in terms of making U.S.-Pakistan relationships because things like education and health were then done by provincial or even district level governance rather than by the center. And the U.S. government has a difficult time interacting. So it'll be interesting to see the next government, what they do in terms of devolution or a strong center. I think it's worth mentioning the census in 2017. This is almost after 20 years Pakistan has had a census. And so you have the redrawing of districts, you have a representation of the huge urbanization that Pakistan has gone through. So what was once primarily, and still largely a rural country, but that youth bulge that you mentioned is coming to the cities. And that is reflective in PTI's vote bank. The activist judiciary, the U.S. government has long supported, a free and fair judiciary. But I think if we look at since 2007, when the Chief Justice Iftikhar Chaudhry was, kicked out by Musharraf, and then the reverberations of that through the years, and the increase in suo motu cases, in the politically motivated cases, and then the 21st Amendment and the ability of the judiciary to be not only activist, but when it wants to be in cooperation with the military, I think is a huge part, unknown, that's part of the U.S. calculation. The media as well, I think the liberalization in 2001 we welcomed as a good thing from the United States. We wanted free and fair media, but I think the reality has been far from that. You see, as Seher mentioned, a lot of the coercion and, Pakistan is one of the places where journalists have, I think, the largest number of attacks on journalists and deaths of journalists. So in terms of media freedom, it isn't doing well. I would point to just this spring, the Geo case, where the military, cut Geo because of their pro-PMLN stance, and they were only allowed back once they agreed to not, show anything that was in support of PMLN. So again, this points to not a free and fair media. And then some of the groups which you mentioned on the terror watch list, which are now contesting elections. This is a huge point of concern for the United States. Groups like Muslim League, which has now changed its name again, the U.S. government has sanctioned LT and JUD and Muslim League, and will probably do the same with AAT. As much as they change their name, it doesn't really matter. But I think this is problematic in two ways. One, in the face of FATF and some of the other concerns the USG has about Pakistan's treatment of terrorists on Pakistani soil, it's very important. I don't think it's a smart move when they've been moved onto the gray list. But second of all, when you have a coalition, who is PTI or PPP, who are they going to look to bring into the coalition? Are they going to look to some of these small parties, which maybe only have a few seats, but may hold that larger party hostage? And we saw this when Musharraf when PMLQ formed a coalition with smaller religious parties. And at that point, it was JUIF and JI, which are not even as extreme as many of these parties, which didn't have avowed terrorists in their ranks. So if these parties actually enter into government, what does that mean for U.S.-Pakistan relations going forward? And I think the larger picture is, could we argue that despite 10 years of continuous civilian-led democracy, there's been a lack of democratic institutional stability? I mean, many have argued, I think from the United States, if you let democracy run in a country, the institutions will get strong and things will naturally stabilize. But I think we've had 10 years of civilian government, 2 transitions, but has that strengthened civilian organizations and institutions like the judiciary, the media, and other things? Or has it been undercut by the continued military influence and intervention. I think the assertion of military influence, as Seher talked about, is very significant here. They are very popular. Raheel Sharif, I remember driving around seeing big posters of General Bobby. Everybody loved General Bobby, and nobody loved the civilian politicians. I think that's fairly common in Pakistan now, this view that the military is our savior. I think that permeates into how we also, the United States, deals with Pakistan. We prefer to deal with the military establishment, especially on the things of interest to us: Afghanistan, terrorism, India, nuclear security. The civilians have little to no say in those issues. And that's why the US government doesn't really care that much about it's, to be very blunt, the civilian institutions are important in that they further democracy. But as for decision-making power on what is important to the United States' national security interests, the military continues to control those things. I think we can see examples where Nawaz Sharif tried to do some things on India or on Kashmir and was very, summarily pushed back by the military. And so if that continues, I think there's now little pretense of the United States even meeting with civilian leaders. I know, at least during my time in government, we made at least the effort to continue to meet with civilian leaders, that we should have the civilians and the military at least together, have transparency between the two, and that the United States shouldn't be going directly to the military leadership. I think, unfortunately, as the military continues to control and accumulate power, even that pretense falls to the wayside, and I think that's dangerous. In terms of outcomes, so I think, as the other panelists have said, it's likely going to be a coalition government, maybe PTI with other parties. Whatever the likely outcome, it's probably going to be weak and unstable, and that leaves the space for the military to continue to dominate the main foreign policy, national security, nuclear security issues. And unfortunately, that allows the United States to continue to only deal with the military, and I think that's an unfortunate thing for Pakistan. So, as we said, the U.S. doesn't really view any civilian leader or government strong enough to challenge the military, and so we prefer, it's much more expedient. You have a competent military, seemingly, and they're the ones who control all of these issues. So while the USG doesn't want to see a military coup, in the short term, it seems to prefer being able to ignore the civilian government. But in the long term, I think dealing with only the military, and we continue to support its behind-the-scenes interventions and the undemocratic distortion of the political system, actually undoes our long-term interests in the region. Because in the longer term, the demographics matter. In the longer term, the geography and reality of Pakistan, its sectarian reality, its demographic reality, and its locational reality make it far more important to U.S. interests than Afghanistan in the longer term. And the U.S. Interests in not seeing an India-Pakistan war or nuclear exchange make long-term stability in this country far more important. And so I would say that we have an interest in providing strong, or at least supporting strong civilian governance, strong democratic institutions. I think a rise of PTI can partially be explained by this burgeoning urban youth who don't see themselves and their aspirations represented by traditional lineage-based, feudal-based, or ethnic-based parties. There's a desire for a new political bargain, and I think we've seen that gradually increase in the last 3 elections. And continued military intervention is not going to resolve that problem. So with that, I would just say that U.S. interests in broader state civility require eventual democratic institutional building. But I would say we need to support Pakistan in doing that. The U.S. is not good at institutional or democratic institution building in other countries. I think we need to join hands with whoever the civilian government is and help increase their own democratic institutions. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Tamana, and thank you to the 3 of you. I thought those are 3 excellent presentations. Look forward to a discussion. Let me exploit my privilege as the chair just to pose the first question, hopefully in a way that each of you can, or all 3 of you can respond. First question, I think it seems clear to all of us on the panel and many observers beyond that it's very unlikely that any one party is going to get an absolute majority. But that said, think we could assume the PTI or the PMLN will win the most seats. What would need to be going right? What will need PMLN to have in its favor to win? What would the PTI need to have in its favor to win? That's one question to throw out there. And the other one is if we assume that there will need to be some type of coalition. If there will need to be a need to negotiate some type of arrangement where you have a power sharing deal. How would that process actually work? I think some of us may not have a sense of, without getting too technical about it, how would the process work? And maybe Maria, maybe you'd want to address this. And then beyond that, once you're getting into this coalition building process, who are the key players that we should be thinking about? Some of the key parties. I mean, we're talking a lot about the PTI and the PMLN. What about the PPP? It's an interesting question. Could Mr. Zardari play some sort of role in these negotiations? And then also, what type of outcome in a coalition would the Army most want to see? I think there's a certain viewpoint that for the Army, what works best is simply a weak coalition, because that would put it in a better position to influence the government if it so chose to do so. But beyond that, are there any particular outcomes that would perhaps work particularly well for the Army? And then, Tamadai, you made a good point about election outcomes not necessarily mattering for the U.S. just in the sense that we continue to deal with the military. But beyond that, thinking about whether there were to be a government in which PTI was leading it, would that make some people uncomfortable? Would it not? So just sort of getting into those types of questions, that would be good. So, Mariam, do you want to start?
Sure. Okay, so we have been talking about PTI or PMLN primarily because that's the big competition between these two political parties is happening in Punjab. So a few facts about Punjab, right? It's home to 55% of Pakistan's population. It is home to 117 constituencies or seats in the National Assembly. It is the largest province. It is the richest province. It is the most developed province. And to that extent, it is the key to the Pakistani government, right? Now, Northern and Central Punjab has traditionally been a PMLN stronghold. And even now, I think most surveys would conclude that PMLN is ahead in Central and Northern Punjab, ahead of PTI, and will probably retain that base, okay? However, what we don't know is how that 14% of the undecided voters that are emerging in almost every survey is talking about this 14% undecided voter and how they're going to determine what happens in Punjab. We don't know where this 14% is going to go, right? And so to your question, what would PTI need or what would PMLN need? I think if there was some way that these two political parties could predict what this 14% is going to do, they would feel a lot more comfortable going into tomorrow's polls. But now, who is this undecided voter? This undecided voter is an individual who may have voted for PMLN but is completely alienated by the political party, especially in the aftermath of Panama Leaks and the disqualification of Nawaz Sharif, the disqualification and then requalification of some PMLN members like Khwaja Asif. So that's one undecided voter, somebody who voted for PMLN and is now alienated by the political party. There are other voters, especially in the urban areas of Punjab, and it's not just Lahore that I'm talking about. I'm talking about Faisalabad, I'm talking about Sialkot, I'm talking about Sargodha, Gujranwala. We've got some pretty huge cities in Punjab, and since you were talking about the demographic dividend, I mean, urbanization in Pakistan has continued at a pace of almost 3%. It's the fastest urbanizing country one of the fastest urbanizing countries in Asia. So that urban voter, the new youth voter, we don't know how to predict how this voter is going to vote. We don't know whether this voter is putting its eggs in PTI's basket or not. We don't know if they are buying into the rhetoric of PTI's Naya Pakistan or buying into PTI's rhetoric of a corruption-free Pakistan, especially when PTI has very clearly shown to this voter base that we are okay to take on corrupt electables to win the seat of power to make the country uncorrupt. It's a very problematic message, okay? So I think there are a lot of people who are unconvinced by PTI as well. I think PTI has to do a better job at getting its message out, right? And PMLN needs to start going back to its base and reassuring it that the party is still strong. Unfortunately, I think for a lot of observers of Pakistan's politics, and especially in the Punjab, is that we don't know exactly what PMLN's fate is. So Nawaz Sharif is in jail along with his daughter Maryam Nawaz, which to many voters just seems like bad strategizing on part of Nawaz Sharif in the way that this whole situation was handled. But for other voters, I think a huge concern, because we do not know who is going to succeed Nawaz Sharif. PMLN being a party which has never held intra-party elections, PMLN being a party which has pretty much been Nawaz Sharif's party, associated with only Nawaz Sharif and the Sharif family. Is Shahbaz Sharif a natural successor? I don't think so. Is Hamza Shahbaz Sharif a natural successor? I don't think so. Both, by the way, also very, very corrupt and can be implicated by the Supreme Court in many different cases, which the appeals are already with the Supreme Court. Nothing has happened, but I'm surprised that Shahbaz Sharif was even cleared to contest this election. I'm surprised his son was cleared to contest the election. So I think PMLN needs to fix its image right now. PMLN may have a record of service delivery and being a political party that has delivered on development, on highways, on CPEC, on electricity, on the metro bus system in Lahore and Islamabad. But where people don't trust PMLN is that they've really, really looted the federal government of a lot of wealth, and I don't think the ordinary citizen in Pakistan is okay with that anymore. So PMLN has an image problem. Very quickly on the power sharing, and then I want Sahar and Tamanna to add on to the answer to the questions that you posed. How would the coalition process work? So the political party that emerges with the largest number of seats is going to have an opportunity to cobble together a coalition. Typically, political parties turn to the independent candidates who win seats, and there's a substantial number of independent candidates contesting this election this time, because many of them did not know which way to turn. Given how unpredictable these elections have been, they didn't know which way to turn, so they're contesting under the symbol of the Jeep. There's a lot of mention of the Jeep. So they're independent candidates, and the first move would be to try and win over these 20 to 25 independent candidates who may win. Please also remember that even though FATA has a partisan electoral system now, and this was and the first time that was the case was in 2013, usually independents contest FATA's election, and so that's a block of about 12 electables who have considerable coalition potential, right? So that's the first thing that a political party would do, turn to the independents. After the independents, I think they will turn to politically expedient political parties like JUIF, which are an easy bet. You know that Maulana Fazlur Rahman is not ideologically principled. He will turn which way the wind blows. And he will fall in line. He toes the line. Why? Because Maulana Fazlur Rahman has figured out how to be a successful politician in Pakistan, which is that become a part of the government, maybe get a cabinet position, negotiate a cabinet position with the political party that's forming the government, and then extract state resources, use those state resources to dole patronage to your constituency, make sure that you are the only one the voters care about, and all's good. right? So because he's figured out this little, he's established this modus operandi. I think that's the next. Those are the kinds of politicians that the coalition will be formed with, which leaves the larger parties. Is PTI PPP coalition possible? Yes, it is. It has already happened. That's how we got the Senate chairman. Senate chairman, who was an independent candidate, Sanjrani, no one had heard of him, but somehow the other PPP and PTI threw their weight behind him, and he was elected as the chairman of the Senate. They have negotiated before. They can negotiate again. Is it going to look good? No, it's not. Okay, so in fact, Michael or Tamanna this morning when we were having coffee, one of them said, "Well, it's going to be the anti-corruption party working with the most corrupt party, right?" So it's going to be an odd coalition. But mind you, all PTI has to do right now is form the government. Okay, if PPP walks away from that coalition, that's okay. They will still manage to find the votes to maintain confidence in the National Assembly. Okay, the crucial step is to form the government. Once you have the government, okay, then other political parties will actually join you because they also want patronage and state resources. Don't forget that modus operandi that Fazlur Rahman has perfected. Okay, that still holds. So who's going to form the coalition? I don't think that's the more interesting question. The question is exactly, once it's done, will they manage to hold it together? I don't think they will necessarily hold it together. Because we've seen that happen before as well. In 2008, Nawaz Sharif's PMLN and PPP formed a coalition government. They booted out Pervez Musharraf, and then PMLN walked away from the coalition. PPP still managed to maintain confidence of the House. So it's happened before, it can happen again. The crucial thing is form the government, and I think for that they will do anything.
Interesting. Sahar and Tamanna, did you want to weigh in?
Sure, I'll speak really briefly on sort of what the army might want, what kind of coalition the army might be looking for. I mean, I think your sense is right. A weak coalition, intuitively works in the army's favor. But I think it'll be interesting to see, who does win. I mean, if PTI does win and Imran Khan sort of is able to form the majority, Imran Khan is unpredictable. In the past, he was very anti-military, and now he's pro-military. So like most politicians in Pakistan, he sways wherever it makes sense for him. My sense with Imran Khan is that it's going to be very hard to see how if he is in power, how that will change the civil-military imbalance. I mean, Imran Khan has never been in this position before. So he's an unknown entity. At least with the Noon League, I mean PMLN, the Nawaz Sharif and the army don't get along. I mean, even the PPP has had its trouble with the military too. With PTI, this will be a completely new thing. And also, with the latest, with the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, right, the sort of the brutal counterinsurgency campaigns that the military has done, it has mostly focused on Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where Imran Khan has the lead, and where he has sort of, told his constituencies that, he is going to protect them, and he's going to protect them from corruption and all of that. So I think it will be very interesting to see how that plays in to the military as well, and how that would affect sort of the domestic counterinsurgencies that the Pakistani military is involved in. My sense is that the military might be backing Imran Khan right now, but I think it's a risky bet.
We've been talking a lot about risky bets this morning.
Yeah.
Tamanna?
Just very quickly on your question about PTI, PMLN, I think in Punjab, voter turnout matters a lot. If the voters stay home, I think PMLN has a better bet. If people come out, PTI has a much better chance. Also, I would just remind everyone there has been no civilian government a party that has been able to win two times in a row. There's a huge anti-incumbency factor in Pakistan. It's never been done. So if PMLN can pull it off, I mean, I have my doubts that they would be able to do it again. In terms of what would it mean, a PTI-led coalition, I mean, the U.S. government has interacted with Pakistan with all sorts of hosts of people in coalition, including Maulana Fazlur Rahman and Jamaat-e-Islami and all sorts. So I don't think that would be a barrier to any sort of U.S.-Pakistan relationship. I think it would be interesting in the fact that Imran Khan is so mercurial how will he, he has campaigned in the past with very anti-U.S. Statements and slogans, and him being prime minister, I think if he continues that, it could be problematic. I think he has also, as you alluded to, Sahar, in terms of his Pashtun base, talked about, spoken out against military operations in Fatah and other places. He was even against some of the SWAT operations. So I think those might be problematic. I think a bigger problem would be two things. One, if he forms a coalition where he includes some of these very unsavory extremist parties in his coalition, those would be very hard to swallow. Two, because he is unpredictable and I would argue uncontrollable, I don't think the military will be, he might be nice to the military in the beginning, but going down the line, I think he will be creating chaos for the military. And so if that distracts the Pakistani military, that's important for the United States. So whenever the Pakistani military is distracted, taking care of domestic instability, political instability, then they have less attention to pay to the things that are important to the United States. And so it is a zero-sum game in that sense. And I think that would be problematic. I think Imran Khan is going to also give voice to some of the sentiments of people about India, about Afghanistan that may not be very popular in Washington. And that will be problematic. Even if he doesn't take any action, I don't think he will have a lot of any power to take action on most of those things, but he will create public sentiment that will maybe anti-US. So.
Can I just quickly add?
Yeah.
So Imran Khan might become prime minister, but who's going to be his foreign minister? Yeah. And the best bet right now is Shah Mahmood Qureshi, who was the foreign minister when Raymond Davis affair happened. So that's going to be a bit problematic as well. So if it's not Shah Mahmood Qureshi, another candidate would be Sardar Asif Ahmad Ali, who was foreign minister under Benazir Bhutto tenure 1, I think. He would be another choice, but Sardar Asif might not even win his seat because I don't think he's nominated.
But I think Shah Mahmood Qureshi actually wouldn't be that big of a problem in the sense that they've worked with him in the past.
Exactly. So
He's
he would
very
be a known
quantity.
quantity. He would be a known quantity.
He knows how to be a foreign minister.
Yeah.
He joked once to me that he's the minister in Yes Minister as he looked at his foreign secretary.
Yeah.
So for all of those who know, his foreign secretary nodded knowingly. So.
Yeah.
And if there were to be a government with Imran Khan in it, one of his, as I understand it, one of his longtime advisors, and one that would probably be an advisor on foreign policy, is Shireen Mazari, who is known for having rather shrill views on the United States, to say the least. Great points made, and I think that what Tamana said before is very important, that the civil-military relationship may not necessarily stabilize if the PMLN is no longer running the government. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Let's go to questions, and please wait until there's a microphone in front of you so that the millions of people watching the live stream will be able to hear you. So let's start right here, and we'll take a few questions consecutively, if that's okay with the panel. This will allow us to get to more. So we'll start here and then move down the line.
There are so many questions to ask, but let me just ask one.
Yes, one is
I
good.
agree on the military. There is a looming financial crisis in Pakistan. There's frequent talk about having to go to the IMF right after the election. What would a Imran Khan coalition government, how would it be able to manage such a crisis? Because if the IMF were to say to agree, they would agree only with terms. It would be politically very difficult to deliver for any government. I'm just struggling to think how this particular group of guys are going to would deal with that.
That's a good question. Of course, if you go to the IMF, that raises questions about the relationship with China and CPEC, because there would need to be more transparent about certain transactions. Anyone want to tackle that? It's a good question.
Sure, I'll take that. I think what Imran Khan has going in his favor is that nobody really knows what kind of leader he's going to be and what exactly he's going to do, and he is unpredictable. Let me just give you a quick example. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, he actually made sure that his chief minister, Pervez Khattak, stopped transferring so-called development funds to the members of provincial assembly. And what it did was it turned the provincial assembly into a legislating body and not a body that is actually responsible for development in local constituencies. And he actually empowered the local governments to do that kind of work. Now, because Imran Khan is unpredictable, he can do something unpredictable. I wouldn't be completely surprised if Imran Khan did something that we would deem unimaginable right now, but something like what the King of Saudi Arabia did in trying to get money, or what the Malaysian government has recently done to try and get to recover some money to keep the government going. I mean, Pakistan's coffers are empty right now, and so yes, they are going to turn to the IMF, absolutely. But turning to the IMF would mean agreeing to some very, very unsavory conditions, which I think it's going to render that render it completely impossible to actually get funding from the IMF. I think that's going to be a no-go. So the one country that might step in to like save Pakistan, it might be China. But even there, we do not know, for the reasons that Tamanna has already pointed out, we just do not know how Imran Khan's going to handle foreign policy, because he has no foreign policy expertise. He has never demonstrated expertise in foreign policy in any of his interviews, and that's, I think, the biggest concern for many voters when it comes to the PTI. They have zero foreign policy experience. But Imran Khan can do something unpredictable, and that unpredictable action might actually be something that works in Pakistan's favor. We just don't know.
If I can just
Yeah.
look at 2008, when President Zardari had the same thing, right? And he was unpredictable, he was corrupt, he knew nothing about the economy, all of that stuff. He thought he could go to China too. He went to China, and the Chinese were happy to give rhetorical support, but no, they're not going to bail you out for nothing. And I think that's still the case. In the end, he had to go to the IMF, and it wasn't him. I mean, there are people they brought in that could negotiate, and I think they're going to be forced to do that.
Yeah.
But it hurt them politically in a huge way. I think that the populist support for PTI will suffer if you accept the conditions that the IMF are going to place.
My mistake, I meant to take questions consecutively, and I forgot. So let's go to Bill Milam and then Marvin.
Well, thanks, Michael. And in fact, you're forgetting to go sequentially. Gives me a chance to answer the question that was just asked, at least in my own way. I've had some experience with this, and I can tell you that the history of Pakistan has to take Woody Allen's advice and take the money and run. So that's what they will do with the IMF, I'm quite sure. They will take the money and they won't fulfill the conditions, and everybody will know that. So that's basically what will happen. Now, I have my questions. First of all, I wanted to ask about this 14%. This 14% that's undecided. Could that be a 14% that's not going to vote? And if it is, doesn't that mean that PMLN has got a much better shot?
It does.
Okay.
It does. I agree with Tamanna on that point.
Second question is that somebody else can answer that first question if they want later. Second question is about the bulge that we've heard about. I've been thinking about that for a long time. Of course, the bulge might be part of the 14%, or the 14% might be part of the bulge. But I'm wondering if the bulge of people under 30 or under 39, whatever it was 69% under 30 or
29, 15 to 29.
29. So you're talking mainly about millennials. And I keep wondering if there isn't, because I've heard rumblings, and then I think of the PTM, not the PTI, the PTM, which is a millennial movement that was pretty anti-military, although it kept it within bounds. And I'm wondering if there won't be, in the case of the Army's accretion of power, a growing movement among millennials to push back against the Army, and popular movements that would spread from the PTM or maybe include the PTM. So I would like to hear I hope that is a clear question. I'd like to hear your answer on that. But third,
This will be the
before
last.
I give up the microphone.
Yes.
I wanted to ask about the, oh God, I've forgotten the question now.
That's okay. But thank you for two good questions.
Well, I don't know about, yeah, I'll ask the third question later, maybe.
Okay. You could hand the mic to Marvin right next to you. We'll take
Marvin
it.
gets to ask a question?
He does, yeah. We'll take.
Real friend here.
Sorry, I've been. If you could all identify yourselves.
Marvin Weinbaum, Middle East Institute. You know, this has been characterized as the dirtiest election ever. Hard to believe once you get to a certain threshold. With that in mind, should we be looking beyond the election and the juggling for a coalition and ask the question that has to be asked after every election? Is it going to be accepted? The history here is whatever the results, you try to delegitimize those who have assumed power. One could easily imagine Imran Khan going to the barricades if he doesn't put together
Oh, yeah.
a winning
Yeah.
coalition.
That's a good question.
PMLN, well, that's less because of its own divisions, and I would imagine Shabazz is not the kind of person who is going to be standing up there at the barricades waving the flag. But even so, there are going to be a lot of unhappy people. So are we looking then, conceivably, together with the economic crisis here, are we looking at a crisis period here, economically and politically, such that we're going to, the United States is going to have to deal with with instability in Pakistan at a level we haven't seen?
Another good question. Why don't we actually take those? I think we got three good questions. A question about this 14%, a question about the role of youth in all this, and in the post-election scenario, if it'll be accepted, implications for stability. So,
Start there.
what's that? Start over.
Um,
Yeah,
Sure.
go ahead.
Let me take the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement question, the PTM question, and youth generally. I think it's a very valid question. For those of people who don't know the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, I liken it to our own Black Lives Matter kind of movement. I mean, it's a grassroots movement against what is seen as military excess and marginalization and penalization of Pashtun youth, I think, more than anything, started by an extrajudicial killing of a Pashtun in Karachi, actually. So I think that is reflective of what I mentioned, you know, where you have the military distorting what is political opinion. I think most youth don't see themselves represented by the PPP or PMLN in some ways, and they don't see themselves necessarily supportive of all the military. I mean, they are supportive generally of the military as protection, as a meritocracy, all of these things, but I don't see every group, especially in large urban areas like Karachi or those coming from minority communities, Baloch, Pashtuns, see themselves represented in these institutions or establishment. And so what does that lead to? It leads to these sort of movements, but it can lead to further, I think, instability and civilian movements. Another thing in Karachi, we were talking to youth in Lahore about the billions of dollars spent fighting India, and most people under 29 don't have that same level of let's continue to spend all this money to prop up the army to fight India. But that is not a very popular view among the army. So all of these different, I think there's a lot of different views that the youth have. Now, it's left to be seen, do they then eventually get usurped into these establishment views, which there were youth before them that had similar, in the 90s, problems with the army and the army's excesses in Karachi. It didn't go anywhere. But I think you're absolutely right to highlight those. And those will be things, I think, if Imran Khan becomes prime minister, he has to address those because those are his vote bank.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. As far as the millennials, being pro-military, having a favorable opinion of the military. I mean, I think, in general, Pakistani people have always looked towards the military as their savior, right? I mean, Rahil Sharif's popularity, General Qamar Bajwa's popularity now. So, I don't think the millennials are, I think they're going to be susceptible to that too at some point. That said, I think because of their sheer number, it's going to be interesting how the military sort of markets itself, right? I mean, in the past, they've sort of been a lot more blatant about power grabbing. I think now the military is becoming a lot more savvy in terms of how it wants to remain in power, and not just remain in power in general, but be in charge of foreign policy and national security. And that's sort of the power that they're interested in. With the millennials, I think, the youth population between 15 and 29, they're not necessarily concerned with war with India. They're more concerned with marriage. Like in the Pakistan National Development Report, it's a great report. It's like 230 pages. It really goes into detail of what is the Pakistani youth, what do they want, what are their priorities. And, I mean, yeah, they have some thoughts about India, but they're more concerned with, can I marry the person that I want? Can I buy the house that I want? Can I buy the car that I want? Can I, get a job, and then can I change jobs, right, if needed? Can I get a promotion based on merit rather than my father's name or lineage or etc. So I think in that way, it's going to be really interesting then how the institutions also sort of respond to that. Whether or not, to Marvin's question, of whether or not the result is going to be accepted, I think if Imran Khan doesn't win, absolutely, he's going to go to the barracks. I mean, he's good at that. He's done that in the past. We've been seeing dharnas for the past 2-3 years now. He's really good at sort of, being critical of those who are in power. The key will be, what does it look like to have Imran Khan in power? I mean, this is the first. It's really easy to criticize government when you're not the government, right? This will be the first time that Imran Khan is in power to do so. So I think, I don't know, maybe a part of him wants to lose so he can still be the the guy who keeps criticizing, But yeah, I mean, I think he's going to be in a position where we might see a different Imran Khan in terms of how critical he is of governance.
Let's go to this side of the room now. There were some hands. Let's start with the gentleman right here, the blue shirt. We'll take a few consecutively again.
Hello, everyone. I'm Faizan Dogar, and I'm with the Hudson Institute. This morning, there has been a lot of discussion about the civil-military imbalance in Pakistan, and I believe rightly so. Some people say that military is more to blame. Some people say that the civilian administration have been. But regardless of that, what the thing that bothers me the most is, like, there's been 10 years of so-called democracy, and yet we're nowhere near to achieving the status of civilians being supreme over the military administration. So my question is, and I'm sure it's a very broad question with no concrete answers, but how does Pakistan go from where it is right now to a position where the civilians are in control of its foreign and national security policy?
Okay, good. That's a tough question. If only we can answer. But if you could pass the mic behind you to the woman. Yes, Anne.
Hi, my name is Ann Follett, and my question is very much related to the previous gentleman's, and that is, how do we move both U.S. policy toward Pakistan and Pakistan's own policies internally toward more of a long game? It seems like the previous question about IMF and how the morning after the election, whoever wins is going to have to go to the IMF. Maybe that would be less of an urgent matter if more than 1% of the people paid taxes. And exactly, and I always think about Larry Summers' famous observation about, in the history of the world, nobody has ever washed a rented car. That in a society where only 1% of the people pay tax, you don't have that sense of ownership. You don't have that sense of engagement at a very deep level. So, in thinking about transitioning from military domination to true civilian leadership, what does that mean? How does that work in a country where nobody pays taxes, where nobody literally has an ownership stake? And then how does the U.S. shift its thinking from what's the most expedient thing to do, engaging with the military, to playing a longer game? Oh, thanks.
Let's come up here. Were there any other questions on this side? Okay, go for it.
Mohammed from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. After this broad question, I want to take you back to Pakistan. On Friday, there was a gentleman in Islamabad, Shaukat Aziz, a justice from Islamabad High Court, who, why he did what he did, why he said what he said. Is it a kind of a frustration of a one individual, or it reflects something bigger in this? Or also it has anything with
Are you
the
talking about the
election?
ex-prime minister or?
You're referring to the accusation of
Of the
ISI
Yeah, of
involvement in the
Okay,
election?
yeah.
Of the
alright.
judge against
Okay, the
ISI
judge.
and the Chief Justice.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So yeah, if I can go first and answer the question of gentleman from the Hudson Institute of, the civilian, like when will we see a time where the civilian institutions are dominant? Institutions are very hard to change. It takes time. 10 years is a very short amount of time. And unfortunately, magic doesn't work. Neither does wishful thinking. So I think this is actually a good thing that elections are taking place, regardless of, they may be the dirtiest elections. Financial Times came up with a headline like that. These elections might be experiencing a lot more military interference than we would like at all. But that said, the fact that they are happening is a big deal. The fact that, Pakistan does have multiple parties, right, is also a big deal. I may not like all the parties, right, especially those who are a lot more sort of extremist point of views, but the fact that, it's sort of a very vibrant political landscape, I think that matters a lot. Now, in terms of whether or not we could ever be at a position where civilians are sort of in power and leading in foreign policy, this will largely depend on the military's power. Like I had mentioned before in my comments, the military in Pakistan is not just a military, right? It functions as a business. It functions as a political organization. They are in the business of making money, right? I mean, they are involved in real estate. They're involved in farming and pharmaceuticals. They own universities. So this is an army that's going to remain in power for a long time. I think it will eventually depend on what kind of chief of army staff we have. Now, in Kayani, we had seen, in 2010, General Pervez Kayani, when he was appointed, we saw sort of like, he told active soldiers to leave their civilian positions. He said that the army should very much remain in sort of, their army camp and not, back to base. And that was sort of seen as finally we have a chief of army staff who believes in the separation of powers, right? But behind the scenes, he was a lot more active. And he very much was into maintaining power, right? Appearances matter in Pakistan, right? At the end of the day, a lot of these major political parties will talk about democracy, but they're feudal, right? I mean, it's a feudal system. And so until those basic things don't change, the people who have power will keep power. That said, I feel that if elections keep happening, and if we sort of more or less see a peaceful transition of power at some point in time, we could see a more sort of balanced civil-military relationship. But whether or not it would ever be a time where the military is beholden to the civilian, that would mean that the business model of the military has failed. And for now, it's working, and it's working well.
Add on to, I agree with everything Sahir said, but I would just, trying to answer the unanswerable question, I guess, that you both have posed here. I think looking at why the military is so popular, I think it's easy for us to always just blame the military. They took over everything. But also, as I think, Sahir, you had mentioned, that often when there's crises or malfeasance or security problems, all the civilians call in the military. I think it's important to look at that since independence, the military has been the one institution that had a meritocracy, that had social mobility until, why is everyone who's in power or wealthy part of the feudal class? Or, the only way that you can move out of your social class largely in the early days of Pakistan was the military, and it largely remains the same. They also have really intra-group cohesion, right? The military has created cohesion and a spirit within it that allows it to become a business and do well as a business, to lead all these host of issues that are important to the country, whereas the political elites and the political system hasn't been able to do that. I think some of the things you would need first for the civilians, you need to build intra-party democracy. PMLN has never had an election within its party. The parties that are the most democratic, as was alluded to, like are Jamaat-e-Islami, or these are the parties where you can be a middle-class person and actually get a seat and actually run. And I think that's a big problem. Until you have intra-party democracy and become a democratic party, you sort of, you say you're democratic, but you're really not. And I would say on the military side, some of the things that Pakistan has tried and that haven't worked well but could continue to try are where the military works with. You're never going to get the military to not do anything on national security, but setting up a National Security Council, which was tried in the last administration, it didn't really go anywhere. But that idea where the military and the civilians and the bureaucrats work well together, I think you can see it in the bureaucratic class. So your civil service, your foreign secretaries, your finance secretaries work very well with the military often. So it's not that they're completely against civilians. They want useful civilians. They want technocratic civilians, right? They want to avoid a lot of the politics. So finding some way for them to work together, I think, is important. And the last one about USG, changing USG long-term calculations. Number one, I think while the United States remains in Afghanistan, there will be no normalization of relations with Pakistan. I think we need to accept that, right? That we can wish, we can hope, but until we find a conclusive way to end the war in Afghanistan, and I will use my USIP hat now, I mean, hopefully through a peace process, that then you can get the interests of the Pakistanis on board, the interests of the Afghans, and you find some resolution, then only can you start to normalize the relations with Pakistan. You have this huge elephant that outweighs everything else. So you will never have a normal relationship with the civilian government until you solve that problem. Secondly, I was just in Beijing a few months ago talking to the Chinese about Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they are thinking long-term. I mean, CPAC, they're thinking about Pakistan 30 years from now, and I do think the United States needs to wake up to that reality that Pakistan wants to be in a relationship with the United States, but they feel, as they have long felt, the love from China, right? So I think it is in our long-term interest for stability, nuclear security, to think about our relationship beyond just the Afghan war.
So I think about this question in a very different way to both your questions in the back about the civil-military imbalance and why has Pakistan had such a tumultuous democratization process. I think about it differently. I actually don't think it from the perspective of the military. As far as I'm concerned, the military is there to stay. They're not going to change. The military, I mean, like Sahar pointed out, they're in the business of making money. They're not going to stop. Okay, so, and when we answer this question about democratization, why is it that we start with the military? Why don't we actually start with the civilians themselves? They're the ones who are the elected representatives. They're the ones who are campaigning. They're the ones who form political parties. And they're the ones who need to want a democracy in the country. And if they don't want a democracy in the country, then, well, the civil-military imbalance is not going to shift. Right? So my approach to answering this question is that, well, let's take a look at who the politicians are and where they come from. And why is it that they entered politics in the first place? The primary reason many of these individuals actually entered politics was not necessarily because they wanted to represent the interests of the people and have a government for the people, by the people, and of the people. They entered into politics because they're trying to preserve their local autonomy within, on the lands that their family has passed on to them, because they want to have access to state resources so that they can continue their involvement in business and industry. They're in politics because they're trying to retain some semblance of prestige and local influence over the people that their families have long had an attachment to. Now, call them feudals. I don't call them feudals because it's not the same thing as West European feudalism. So let's not use the word feudal, but this is a land-owning elite. Okay, and it's a land-owning elite that was put into place by the British colonizers. And we haven't gotten over that legacy of British colonialism, where the British colonial master administered what became Pakistan, West Pakistan, through these rural leaders who either had spiritual dominance over people. So in this particular election, we've had a lot of news stories about the peers who are contesting elections. So spiritual leaders, or they were landowners, and they don't want democracy. Because if you look at these individuals, they have been willing to kowtow to whoever is in power. They have been willing to be co-opted by the military. They have been willing to work with whichever political party comes to power. And if you look at the recruitment and candidate selection practices of all the political parties, okay, somebody mentioned that there's no intra-party democracy. Absolutely, there's no intra-party democracy, because what's a political party in Pakistan? It is merely a vehicle for these individuals that I just mentioned, be they rural or urban elite, to actually make it to the National Assembly or the Provincial Assembly so that they can have access to state resources that they will then use to dole out patronage to their constituents. Retain local autonomy. These politicians are operating like franchises almost. So think of the Pakistani, whichever political party forms the government basically gives out, 200 franchises, and each franchise operates on its own. There is no semblance of thinking about a national policy in the national legislature. You come to parliament because you want money from the state in the form of development funds that you can then put into your constituency, win a next election, right? So what are political parties doing wrong? Well, political parties are continuously recruiting individuals who have their own base of power. They don't need a party ticket. They don't need a party platform. They can win elections on their own as independents. So what is a political party doing for these entities? The political party is just adding that little bit of party vote to make sure that the margin of victory is greater than it would be if they were to just rely on their own personal vote. So if political parties cannot actually make the party ticket valuable for any of these candidates, why do we expect democracy? Because these candidates can very well turn to the military dictator who comes in via a coup, if ever, and work in that National Assembly as well, get the same resources, and keep themselves relevant in politics. And that is exactly what the PMLQ politicians did back in 2002. And that is exactly what those very same politicians have done by joining either the PMLN or the PTI as party switchers. Unless and until political parties in Pakistan cannot elicit credible loyalty from the candidates that it's recruiting, we are not necessarily going to move towards a system where the civilians will ever be able to dominate the military. The military is here to stay. And the military is going to recruit politicians in the same way that political parties have done so. Mind you, look at who the military puts into power whenever it takes power. What did Ayub Khan do? What did Ziaul Haq do? What did Pervez Musharraf do? They recruited the same politicians that I'm talking about, put them into power, put them back into the National Assembly, and along we went. Okay? So the military is not going to change. We don't expect the military to change. Your politicians need to want democracy.
Sobering point.
Can I
Tell
just
me-
add
yeah,
a
go
quick
ahead,
comment to
quickly.
what Mariam said? I agree with you wholeheartedly. She makes a good point in terms of motivation. So the military had one tiny motivation to maybe change, which was international disrepute whenever they would make a coup
Exactly, yeah.
or some sort of image problem, and they've solved that wonderfully. They now just control everything from behind the scenes. And so I don't think you're going to see, everyone's like, well, will there be a coup? They don't need to do a coup. They can control everything and still say they support democracy and have pictures of General Bobby on the streets of Pindi, right? So why would you risk your image, your international legitimacy, and your popularity?
Well, unfortunately, we're going to need to wrap up. Fascinating discussion. Very quick preview. Here at the Wilson Center, we're just fascinated by the Pakistan election. We did this event previewing it on Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. We're going to have a ground truth briefing, which is a phone conference call in which we're going to have 3 experts on the ground in Pakistan giving a assessment after the election. I should have put flyers outside our website, wilsoncenter.org. There's a link to it. It's at 10 o'clock on Thursday. Pam Constable from the Washington Post, Musharraf Zaidi, who writes for the News, and Zahid Hussain, who writes for Dawn, will all be speaking. So do think about participating. You call in, it's all free. You could ask questions, whatever you'd like. So I'd like to thank our 3 panelists for a really terrific conversation. Thank you. And we're adjourned. Thank you all for coming.